Joan Kiddell Monroe was born on the English southern coastal town Clacton-on-Sea in 1908. Nothing else is recorded about her life until 1930, when she went to study at the Chelsea School of Art. Following graduation, she initially started working in an advertising studio, but as with many others in the series, there's nothing to be found of her early output. In the later 1930s, she married Webster Murray, a Canadian illustrator and portrait painter, at which point she gave up her job at the agency to travel to Africa with her husband. By the time they returned, England was at war with Germany, and Kiddell Monroe joined the Women's Voluntary Service to do her bit for King and Country. But in 1940, her story about a panda titled In His Little Black Waistcoat was published, although all I could find was the cover and one-page illustration. And despite the ongoing war in 1943, she followed this with another of her own authored works, Ingulabi, possibly the only children's book written about a South African bush pig, with her own textured, limited-coloured drawings worked around the text. In 1944 she gave birth to a son, but she carried on working, and a year later her illustrated edition of Mary Norton's children's fantasy The Magic Bedknob was published, with both spot colour and some minimal but expressive monochrome illustrations. In 1946, with the war now over, she returned to African themes with Munya the Lion, written by Dorothy Martin, with a series of engaging and anatomically credible two-colour images of lions both young and old, using a sketchy graphite or charcoal-based technique. Whether it was based on observation from her time in Africa or drawn from the zoo I couldn't say, but the results were particularly convincing and evidently from some form of study. Unlike her other work to date, she obviously felt no need to resort to anthropomorphism in her animal characters. In the same year she demonstrated graphic versatility with some radically different, orientally styled colour pages, using a vivid limited palette for the story The Dragonfish by the American writer Pearl S. Buck. At this time Kiddell Monroe illustrated several books written by David Seven, but the only one I could find decent images from was the horse-themed tale for teenagers Ponies and Poachers, published in 1947. The illustrations for this book were entirely in black and white and looked like they were created as wood or lino cut, although I don't know for sure if they actually were. Also published in that year, War the Ape was another of her own authored works, which contained more well-observed and convincingly rendered two-colour illustrations to illuminate the story. And in what was rapidly becoming a trademark aspect of her compositions, she left as much to the imagination as she actually included. And she evidently followed the same winning formula for 1948's The Irresponsible Goat, but frustratingly I couldn't find all that much evidence of this book either. But it was also in 1948 that she deviated significantly from her expected approach with the first book in the series The Adventures of Wonk by Muriel Levy. These books were significantly more mainstream in their narrative and visual appeal, and they were Kiddell Monroe's first commercial outing into the creation of full-colour line and wash images. It was also the first time she had created an anthropomorphic and deliberately engaging animal character to accompany the boy protagonist through a series of quite unadventurous but endearing adventures. And the popular success of this quite sentimental series must have greatly boosted Kiddell Monroe's financial rewards to date, assuming she was allowed a share of the royalties, that is. In 1949 she returned to Oriental subject matter for a particularly engrossing and convincingly evoked edition of The Cat Who Went to Heaven by Elizabeth Coatsworth, originally published in the USA in 1930. And her collection of lightly amusing but nevertheless keenly observed illustrations, which made telling use of limited colour palettes with elements of sprayed backgrounds, made for a visually satisfying illumination of the story. Unfortunately, all I can show you of her work for Maribel Edwin's This Way to Greenacres is Kiddell Monroe's dynamic cover, but to compensate for that serious shortfall, 1951's illustrated edition of the Arabian Knights offers a surprisingly large number of impressive images of considerable aesthetic merit. I have no idea how commercially successful this book was, but in purely creative terms, this was arguably her finest achievement to date. Kiddell Monroe produced a large volume of highly accomplished monochromes, all of which make great use of particularly telling and skillfully executed calligraphic brush line, again with the addition of splattered ink to form an atmospheric bridging tone between pure black and white. And if this has been the extent of her contribution, it would still have been a particularly noteworthy achievement. But what really set this book apart was the remarkable collection of full-colour, full-page illustrations, each of which perfectly captured the Middle and Far Eastern narratives of the book. She harnessed Oriental drawn styles to further lend visual interest and aesthetic appeal to the images, and in this instance she used a bright saturated colour palette applied expressively in gouache, both dilute and opaque. Along with the monochrome pages, this made for a particularly engrossing body of work. In terms of her career achievements, the book proved to be a hard act to follow, but in 1953 she returned to her more naturalistic textural style for a collection of vignetted monochromes to illustrate the book The Boy at the Swinging Lantern by Patricia Lynch. But it was with Eileen O'Phelan's Book of Irish Sagas and Folk Tales, published by Oxford University Press in 1954, that she returned to her more graphically stylised approach with considerable success. Kiddell Monroe created a large number of three-colour printed illustrations, with a visually satisfying limited palette of mint green, pale sand and black. These images were quite selective in the elements chosen for any given illustration, and they were set attractively on the page as swirling, energetic vignetted compositions. There were also monochrome pen and ink images dotted throughout the book, and these added to the considerable visual qualities of this publication. And steering effortlessly from one style to the other, in the same year she created more overtly representational monochromes for an edition of the chimpanzee-themed Aworo, written by René Guyot. In 1956, the Oxford University Press published the second in their folk tales series, for which Kiddell Monroe again made use of another attractive limited palette for a collection of Russian stories, with equally compelling monochrome spot illustrations throughout. Sadly, her husband died in 1957, and following her loss she returned to Africa briefly with her son before settling permanently on the Spanish island of Majorca. And in addition to her narrative illustration work, in the later 1950s she ventured outside her usual terrain and produced a series of compelling book jacket designs for suspense novels written by Josephine Bell. But these were more the exception than the rule, and in 1958 she returned to the illustration of Oxford University's Tales from Around the World. And although not the only one published in that year, her work for Japanese myths and legends was another perfect match for her sophisticated linear and spot colour evocations. And this series in particular begs the question what she was using for the reference of these stories. As far as I can tell, all clothing in both interior and exterior environments look flawlessly researched, even if not realistically rendered. Whatever reference she used, she was obviously assiduous in her research. In the following year she returned to the writing of René Guyot for Grishka and the Bear, and took the opportunity to flex her creative muscles again with her more grainy naturalistic monochromes. And she did it again in the same year with the publication of Fury, Son of the Wilds, a horse-themed adventure written by H.M. Peel. But 1960 saw the publication of two more telling examples of Kiddell Monroe's graphic prowess. Her visualisation of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's The Song of Hiawatha featured relatively simplified fine line work and a range of flat second colours applied strategically to each image. And each illustration sat on the page with the relevant verse to lead the reader through this epic romanticised tale of tribal America. Her version of Homer's Iliad in the same year was entirely black and white, but that didn't adversely affect the impact of the dramatic images, which were clearly inspired by ancient Greek art and decoration. Their formality of composition and again use of flawless calligraphic lines had echoes of the work of Aubrey Beardsley, And although this meant characterisation and emotion were not unduly evident, their absence was more than made up for by the decorative formal structure of the images. But in the following year she outdid herself again with what has become certainly one of, if not the most enduring high points of her career. Aesop's Fables had already been and would continue to be one of the most illustrated books of all time, and Kiddell Monroe's interpretation, whilst being one of the least naturalistic, nevertheless captured the visual essence of all the moralist short tales contained in the collection. Once more she was limited, a term I hesitate to use in her case, to only a single colour and black. But of course it was this very limitation which gave these images such lasting and memorable appeal. It was with these images that her pursuit of calligraphic expression really reached a pinnacle of excellence, and led her to create illustrations of near abstract beauty, but which retained all the characterisation of the animal and occasionally human players in the story. And despite the absence of obvious anthropomorphism and the extreme nature of her calligraphic curves, the images still had immense personality. Every image was perfectly balanced on the page, background elements were almost non-existent, and the spot colours applied with consideration in every case. And these images of her actual artwork show how she marked up the drawings as guides for the printer. The same year saw the publication of Chinese myths and legends, and as with her others in this series, these illustrations were impeccable, highly attractive illuminations of the Oriental tales featured, with a pleasingly subtle three-colour palette. And in what was evidently an enduringly prolific period of creative production, in 1962, she also illustrated Virgil's ancient Greek epic, the Aeneid, with a collection of formally composed two-colour character-based images, which could have quite plausibly come from decorated Greek pottery of the period. And as if this outpouring of creative activity wasn't more than enough, in the same year she returned to the Oxford University Press series, this time for not only a book of Indian tales, with the expected fascinating limited colour and monochrome images, but also another of equal exotic appeal and graphic consideration for tales of African origin in a dazzling rush of creative output. The book The Heroes had originally been written by Charles Kingsley, more famous as the author of The Water Babies, in 1855, and Kiddell Monroe's 1965 edition brought these tales from around the world to vivid life for a more contemporary readership, and contain numerous full-colour illustrations created with pen brush and watercolour washes. Although as with much of her output, these illustrations were far from representational, but they nevertheless effortlessly engage the reader with carefully and attractively arranged elements of background and character to create a visually immersive experience. But limited colour remained her usual approach, and in 1965 the Book of Myths by Roger Green collected stories and legends from around the ancient world, and Kiddell Monroe illustrated each with what was by now her trademark smooth curving black line and single colour overprint technique. In 1966 she illustrated what would be the last of her Oxford University Press series of folk tales from around the world, with a West Indian edition featuring a worthy collection of mint green, grey and black images. And although it would be fair to say that she had been somewhat typecast in the production of this long-running and successful series, both the colour work and the monochromes were every bit as engaging as her first outing had been. Despite this general dominant tendency towards calligraphic more formal expression in her later work, 1969's Tales from the Marble Mountain, written by Hugh Gardner, was a well-considered return to texture, with a series of particularly appealing animal-themed scenes with more than the usual level of comedic input from the illustrator. As far as I can tell, this was her last published work, and Joan Kiddell Monroe died in Mallorca in 1972 when she was only 64 years old. During her relatively short lifetime, she'd illustrated a large number of books, and of course was also the author of several of them. And although there were more overtly commercially minded books produced, including the enduringly successful Wonk the Koala, in the main Joan Kiddell Monroe ploughed an illustrative path driven far more by the pursuit of pure aesthetic concerns. She invariably put the narrative demands and visual appeal of the image at the top of her priorities.